have thought that storing up a couple of acorns would cause so much trouble? I mean, it's pretty obvious that Scrat, the squirrel, had a hard time letting things go. It's kind of funny when you see it in a little kid's cartoon, but it's not that funny when it's adults who spend their whole life sometimes storing up these acorns, and despite what may tragically happen, they just go right back and start storing them up again. I think that was a pretty vivid description of what we have been discussing here in the book of Ecclesiastes. So far in our study, the teacher, the king of Israel, who we believe to be Solomon, raised a pretty substantial question. And if you look in your bulletins, there is a sermon notes page, and I put the scriptures there and just a couple of points that I'd like to make with you. So just look at the passage, and you'll see on the top that I put a question. And that question is, what does a man gain for all his toil under the sun? That was the question that Solomon posed early in the book. And it's a question that he is continually going back to. In the question, Solomon joins the issue of gain. So what does a man gain? As if all of our labors, all of our toil, everything that this life is about ought to result in something. We ought to have some level of success. There ought to be some way that we can mark the advantage that we've had because of all that we have put into this. And the assumption then is that we ought to be able to find a way to be successful. It reminded me of a woman who went to her boss and she asked her boss, what does it mean to be successful? And her boss, she looked at her and she said, well, you have to make good decisions. And so the girl thought for a moment and then looked back at her mentor and said, okay, well, how do you make good decisions? And she said, make bad decisions. Because if you make bad decisions, you're going to figure it out soon enough that you don't want to do that again. And you'll work at this until you finally come up with a good decision. Solomon, in our book, has begun to learn from some bad decisions. Life for him has taught him a number of lessons in a variety of ways. Now, I know we can learn from our colleagues, we could learn from friends, we can learn from relatives. It seems to me that the lessons that stick, though, are those lessons that we learn something when it has cost us something. Lessons that we glean from some struggle that we are dealing with. Solomon has been looking for some answers, but it seems that it's been coming up a bit short for Solomon. And I want you to think about this for a moment. Solomon has gone to tell us that there was little gain for all the labors under the sun. Think about that for a moment. Solomon had position, king over all of Israel. He had prosperity, the likes of which there was no one his equal in all the land. He had the privilege of unhindered opportunity. Think about it. If you had the money and you had the intellect and you had the opportunity to do whatever you want, then you would start picking some really cool options for yourself probably, right? But then you get this note of reality and saying, well, I might have the money, but I don't have the time that I can take. Or I have plenty of time, but I don't have enough resources. Or I wouldn't know really even where to begin to do some of these things. See, all of that was not Solomon's problem. Solomon, we're told, if you read through the book of 1 Kings, in the first 11 chapters of 1 Kings, it gives you a whole description of who Solomon was. And what it tells you is that God gave him wisdom as a gift. And that wisdom began to spread, and it gave him such notoriety over all the world that the Queen of Sheba would come and seek his counsel. Dignitaries from all over the world paid him homage. They would give him gifts. And so his coffers just got bigger and bigger and bigger. There was no one like Solomon who had position, privilege, and he had the opportunity. So you see, when he turns around and he begins to look, you begin to see that even though he was touting all of his accomplishments and acquisitions, his achievements, he would look at them and say, it was nothing more than chasing after the wind. If you have a New International Version, the word there is meaningless. But I hope that by now you've begun to understand that this word meaningless is an interpretation of a Hebrew word that has a lot of nuances to it. And those nuances have, the word actually literally means breath or vapor. And so figuratively, it has come to mean words like meaningless or transitory or illusory. Because it's something that it seems like it has substance, but you just can't get your hands around it. So it's like this prize, but you try to grab it, but it's like a cloud. It looks like it has substance, but your hand just goes right through it. So Solomon, at this stage of his life, looks back, and one of the lessons that he learned was that in all of those accomplishments, in all of those acquisitions, it still hasn't given me the sense of meaning and purpose for which I have been striving. And that's why I think when we look at this text, it's important that we understand maybe some of the lessons that Solomon learned so that we won't have to bang our head against the same wall. Look what he says here in verse 12. It says, "Then I turned my thoughts to consider wisdom and also madness and folly. What more can the king's successor do than what has already been done?" I would think that it's kind of difficult to imagine that someone with a lesser position, prosperity, and privilege, that person could accomplish more than what Solomon has revealed for us already in the 2nd chapter here of Ecclesiastes. I mean, when you read through this list of all the things that Solomon has done, can I just refresh some of your minds here? It says, Solomon says, "I undertook great projects. I built houses for myself. I planted vineyards. I made gardens and parks. I planted all kinds of fruit trees in them. I made reservoirs to water flourishing groves of flourishing trees. I bought male and female slaves, had other slaves who were born in my household. I also owned more herds and flocks than anyone in Jerusalem before me. I amassed silver and gold for myself and the treasure of kings and provinces. I acquired men and women singers. I had a harem as well, 700 wives, 300 concubines." See, when you read these lists and you recognize what Solomon has amassed in his lifetime, it was his experiment to see what could I do that would make me happy. And there was nothing that was off limits to him. And yet, in verse 10 of chapter 2, he says this, and you can write this in your notes. It says, "My heart took delight in all my labor, and this was the reward for all my toil." So basically what he's saying is, the enjoyment that I got was in doing it. But then after I did it, notice what he says. Evidently, the return on investment wasn't sufficient for Solomon, for he laments everything was like a vapor, transitory, puzzling, meaningless, a chasing after the wind. Nothing was gained under the sun. Nothing was gained under the sun. I thought we just read this long list of all the things that he got, all the things that he did, all the experiences that he had. So the king is looking back at all of that and saying, yeah, It was so transitory. Notice what he says here in verse 13. He says, I saw that wisdom is better than folly, just as light is better than darkness. The wise man has his eyes in his head, while the fool walks in darkness. Now, Solomon did learn some things, right? He goes on, he says, but I came to realize that the same fate overtakes them both. And what is that? Then I thought in my heart, the fate of the fool will overtake me also. So what then do I gain by being wise? This is a puzzle. It's meaningless. For the wise man, like the fool, will not be long remembered. In days to come, both will be forgotten. Like the fool, the wise man too must die. And now you begin to recognize what has become a problem for him. That the same fate that overcomes the fool is going to overcome the wise man. But he says there is some benefit though, right? He says there's a benefit to living life with wisdom, more so than being a fool. I mean, who wants to walk around in the dark? Let's turn on a couple of lights. It's a lot easier to walk in the light rather than stumbling around in the darkness. And that's what he says wisdom does, because he says the wise man has eyes in his head, which is to say his mind is engaged when he looks out on the world. Then I put that in your notes, because that's the benefit of wisdom. That your mind is engaged when you look out at the world, so you can make good decisions about things. Evidently, it's not so much with the fool. The fool doesn't have the eyes in his head. Evidently, it seems that they rest in another part of his anatomy. He's not making good decisions. But didn't we learn something about the limitations of wisdom last week? Part of that limitation was that wisdom could help you to diagnose a problem. Wisdom could help you to remove some of that illusion so that you could take a very clear look at things. But wisdom was never sufficient, not man's wisdom, to necessarily fix the problem of meaning and purpose. But he goes on in this text there, it says that somewhere in his mind he began to recognize that there's a fate that's going to overcome both the wise man and the fool. And then, have you ever had a thought that comes into your head and you're thinking about it, and then all of a sudden that thought leads to another one, and your own face gives it away. You go from like listening and you go like, oh, and then you go, oh. Because what happened to Solomon was when he was thinking that the same fate is going to fall the guy who's wise and the guy who's foolish, it suddenly dawned on him that the same fate is going to happen to me. And what is that? There is this limitation that he spent so much time and resources on doing things wisely that he failed to recognize that all the while he was really using up the ultimate resource, which was time. You get it? He says, I was wise. One day, it's just going to be reduced to I was. Kind of like those footprints on the seashore that we talk about, where the waves come in and let it go about 4 or 5 times, and then the next thing you know, you can't even see those footprints anymore. So that's what our life is like. We are not going to be long remembered. The truth is, both are going to be forgotten. So then what does that say? The limitation of wisdom is simply this, that wisdom is no match for death. He introduces now our mortality, because now what he's basically saying to you and me is, as you live your life, you have to live your life consciously aware that this isn't an endless resource. Time is not an endless resource. You only have so much. And those of you who are in your 30s or younger, you think you have all the time in the world, but I'm sure if we sat down around a table, you could tell me some of your contemporaries, people in pop culture, that their lives ended when they were in their 20s and 30s. That their habits or their way of living has curtailed their lives. And despite the fact that they had so much going for them, they didn't realize that their middle age happened when they were like 12. So you think, I have all this time. Think again, because that is not in your control, is it? And so now I'm staring at my mortality, and death is a fierce enemy. There's nothing that we experience in this life like it. It just speaks with such finality. You can't negotiate with death. You can't appease death. You can't satisfy its hunger. You cannot turn it away. And regardless of all of our worldviews, our mortality can never be dismissed from the equation. That's just life. That's the truth. And so between that day and the days that we have in between, we're all searching around for what's going to give us this sense of meaning and purpose. And so in the face of that mortality, how many people then just turn around and say, you know what? If I'm going to die someday, I may as well just go for it. I may as well just go for the gusto, grab that brass ring, get as much as I can, enjoy everything I can. Don't hold back from anything that seems to promise you happiness. And if there was no reckoning on the other side of this life, then I'd agree with you. May as well just go for it. Just do whatever you can, man, because this is all you get. But can I remind you, like, who's writing these words? The one who's writing these words is Solomon, who did that very thing, who gave everything to going after whatever it was that could satisfy this desire in his heart. Anything that promised to give him a sense of happiness and pleasure, I'm in it. And this is the same person who says now, at the end of his days, he's looking back and he's saying, you know what? What is the gain? Where's the surplus? Yeah, there was a delight, the same word there for pleasure, right? There was a delight in the doing, but not enough to keep me. Somehow or another now, he discovered that what he was chasing after was never really going to fill his tank. So do you think that you, in your limited resources, in your limited time, in your limited, sphere of influence, you think you're going to do better? So why would you go down a road that's already been marked one way? That's a foolish decision. And sometimes it takes a whole lot of gray hair to come to that conclusion. But for you younger people that are in this congregation this morning, why would you want to do that? When it's already been told you can't do what the king already did. So I want you to notice something here in verse 17. In verse 17, that kind of realization, it left him to a place where he says, I hated life. And that's pretty severe. He says, I hated life because the work that is done under the sun was grievous to me. Why? Because he says, I looked at it as nothing more than vapor. It was an illusion. I was chasing after something that wasn't real. I was chasing after the wind. Now he's puzzled because he put the bet down on this number, and it didn't happen. So it left a bad taste in Solomon's mouth. It caused him now to view all of his projects and acquisitions and accomplishments with a jaundiced eye. It no longer held the charm that it once did. I remember I was sitting there thinking about that, and all of a sudden that old blues song by B.B. King came to my mind. The thrill is gone. The thrill is gone away from me. Yeah, it is a reason for the blues. His accomplishments were securely anchored in time, but his time was passing. I'm sure Solomon thought in reflection, all of my planning, all of my efforts, all of my building, it was only a temporal source of achievement that hasn't really filled my tank, and it's left me wanting more. So why has his view soured? Why has his happy heart turned? What? Why is he looking at his life with such disdain? Well, look what it says in verse 18. In verse 18, he says, I hated all the things I had toiled for under the sun, because I must leave them to the one who comes after me. And who knows whether he will be a wise man or a fool, yet he will have control over all the work into which I have poured my effort and skill under the sun. This too is puzzling. This too is a vapor. This too is such an illusion. Why? Well, you know the answer to this. It's the old adage, you can't take it with you. He just came to that realization. The reality that he has to leave it all behind hit him hard. Oh, you like all that nice jewelry? Oh, it looks awesome, right? Yeah, well, you're not taking it with you. The reality is that he leaves it behind. Another one will wind up taking the spoils of his kingdom. And who might that be? He could very well be a fool. Because here's the other reality. All our stuff will one day be controlled by another. You work so hard for all those acorns, and you put them all in this nice big container, and you think, well, now, man, I got it made. My father-in-law was 64 years old, was able to retire, and then he came down with lung cancer, and it took his life just a few years after. He thought he had all this promise. He was a man's man. My father-in-law, man, he was smart, and he had you know a really awesome kind of career. And then all of a sudden now he has no more time. And in the hospital room, we led him to Jesus. Because he finally figured out what Solomon has been saying. What did I gain? You can't take it with you. And the reality is someone else is going to control your stuff. And it's going to come to someone who probably will never really fully appreciate its value. Someone who may just squander it. Obviously, someone didn't earn it. Their only claim to your stuff is that they have more time than you do. So isn't that confusing? Isn't that puzzling? Isn't that so much an illusion? It's meaningless. And that's what Solomon says. So with that realization, look what he says in verse 20. My heart began to despair over all my toilsome labor under the sun. For a man may do his work with wisdom, knowledge, and skill, and then he has to leave it all he owns to someone who has not worked for it. This too is a puzzle, transitory, a vapor, a great misfortune. See, now something happened to Solomon When he started really looking at what he thought was going to give him all this joy and happiness, he looks at it now, and it made him hate life. It made him look at all that he had done under the sun with disdain. He hated it. And now his heart's in despair. Why? Because the trophies that he earned from all of his learning and doing and accomplishing, he looks at them and they no longer give him the joy that they once did. Now he realizes this was like chasing after the wind. See, the years have caught up to him. And now, as we look at our text, we see that his things will they no longer bring him the comfort they once did. His time to enjoy them are going to pass. So this thought came to me. I wonder if this juncture in Solomon's life, he got up one day and he started walking around his palace. And again, if you haven't read 1 Kings chapters 1 through 11, you should go back there and read it because it gives you the details of Solomon's reign. But he walked into this palace. It had some of the finest articles that anybody in the world could have owned. I wonder if he walked by them and as he was appreciating all of these things that he had, the craftsmanship, how rare those pieces were, how few in all the world could really have one of them, not to mention the collections that he had. I wonder if, as he was walking around looking at all of them, something just switched in his head. And instead of looking at them for how much they cost, now he looked at them as to how much time they cost. Because I wonder if he thought in his own head, this house, it's beautiful. But was it worth 13 years of my life? These gardens that I built, these reservoirs that I oversaw the project, I don't think I can remember how many times I just sat outside and enjoyed the garden. 700 wives, 300 children. Has the thought ever come to you as you're reading this that he never once mentions any of his kids? When you read in 1 Kings, in chapter 11, one of his sons, Rehoboam, winds up trying to wrench the kingdom from his father's hands. When you live in a day and an age where men father children and then they're not fathers, what happens to those kids? Can you imagine having now 700 wives, 300 concubines, all the children? Last week we read that his daily provisions for food for Solomon's household included, and this is just one thing, right? It said it included 185 bushels of fine flour. One bushel makes 91 pound loaves of bread. So 90 times 185 is over 16,675 loaves of bread. There's a lot of mouths to feed in Solomon's household. That was daily. But now when he's looking back on his life, it doesn't seem like any of those relationships are filling the gap for him. There's none of that at the end of his life, sitting down and having his kids come to him and bring a sense of joy. Because he probably wasn't very much of a father to any of them. And so can you understand now, like this guy is sitting here and he realizes that wealth and power, that's not really the currency. Neither is pleasure. And neither is wisdom. I think he would gladly exchange all of that for a little more time. but time will soon rend the kingdom from his hands, as well as his fortune. Is it any wonder then that his heart began to despair over all his toilsome labor? And why? Again, if you're young, listen to me. Listen to Solomon. What he's saying to you is, it wasn't worth the hype. The pursuit of the things promised, they promised more than they delivered. And we're all going to learn that on one level or another. But pay attention. Don't be like that squirrel that after he lost all the acorns, he gave himself to collecting them all over again. Learn from that. Learn from the disappointments of placing your happiness in areas that will never prove to be up to the hype. Not things. See, that's why I look at the end here in verse 22. He says, what does a man get for all the toil and anxious striving for which he labors under the sun? All his days, his work is pain and grief. Even at night, his mind doesn't rest. Once again, we return to this vexing question. And Solomon doesn't, you notice, listen, Solomon doesn't answer the question with how much stuff he had. What does a man gain? Well, let me tell you, I have this, I have that. He doesn't tell you that. Solomon doesn't answer the question with how skilled or wise or cultured he had become. Solomon didn't answer the question with the good life, even though he had his fair share of it. The truth is, Solomon found it difficult to answer the question, what does a man gain for all his toil under the sun? Because it revealed a bitter reality to him. So how would you answer that question? If someone asks you, what does a man gain for all of his toil under the sun? How would you answer that question? I believe that Solomon thought his life should have turned out differently. I think he found it hard to fathom how he got to this place, where now his life is full of despair instead of peace, that he had a hatred for life, a constant wrestling for meaning and purpose instead of a contentment that would soothe his heart. But let me turn a page now, because I don't believe that Solomon just wants you to feel as depressed as he was. That's not the point. But sometimes, if you've ever broken a bone and you go to a doctor, he has to set that bone back in place, right? Isn't that painful? Well, see, what Solomon is doing here is like setting our values straight. And he has to tell you the dark side before he can tell you the bright side. And he will tell you the bright side. The conclusion just comes in a few short verses. And I'm going to talk more about that next week, because I want us to live in this space just a little bit longer, so that maybe its message really seeps in, that it has a way of causing you now, if you're younger, you have your whole career ahead of you. Maybe it puts a little pause in your spirit about where you're going to put all that value. I have a little 7-year-old grandson, and they gave him this little exercise in school to write his top 3 wishes. His first one was, I want to win the Powerball. My second wish is to have all the money. And the third wish is to eat all the ice cream I ever want. And we all cracked up. Not so funny when you're 57. And somewhere along the line, you got to grow up and recognize that, yeah, I can go and chase all these things, but everybody and everything around you says it is never going to be enough. So I want to end with you with this one story here. And it's in your bulletins. It's from the New Testament. These are words from Jesus, the one greater than Solomon. He says, someone in the crowd came up to Jesus and said, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me." I love these kinds of stories in the Bible. You know why? Because they're so filled with real life. So let people come up to me and say, "Well, I can't read that Bible, man. It's so ancient." Really? Have you ever been in a family where people start arguing over money and stuff? And now they want Jesus to settle this argument. And he says, "Look, I'm not appointed to be this judge or arbiter between you." And then he gives them the warning. Watch out. Be on your guard against all kinds of greed. And now underline this sentence, memorize this sentence, take it and put it on your refrigerator. If you're 70 years old, take this and get a tattoo. That'll get your grandkids talking. A man's life does not consist in the abundance of his possessions. That's exactly what Solomon was saying. Your life is so much more than stuff. But he lost that along the way. So to drive this lesson home, Jesus says a little parable. He says, look, the ground of a certain rich man produced a good crop. Can I just pause there for a moment? Some of you have had a whole childhood of learning about agriculture. I'm an excellent farmer, growing up in the concrete jungles of New York City. But I have learned some things about plants, and my wife, she's great at it, but my job is just to be the one with the strong back to dig the holes. But I'd watch, and I'd say, well, you ought to get that plant, put it there. And she goes, no, you can't put that plant there. It gets too much sun. I said, isn't that good? She goes, no, these plants really like shade. We have to buy those plants because they like sun. And then she'll buy these bags of fertilizer. And I said, oh, great. You want me to just spread it all around? No. You don't put it on these plants because you'll kill them. I'm like, what the heck? I got to buy special food for this plant? Who does he think he is? Something special? And then you recognize that you have to understand how this whole thing grows. But what happens when it doesn't rain for a long time? Or you get these days where the sun is so hot, you can't keep up with it. And some of those plants, they can't handle it. They wither and they die. And then you realize, I have no control over making this thing grow. What I can do is create an environment for the plant to grow. I can water it, I can give it the right nourishment, I can put it in the right spot, but God has to make it grow. So when this guy goes out and looks at his great crop, he made a mistake, man. He thought that he had something to do with it. He goes on and it says here, what shall I do? I have no place to store my crops. Then he said, this is what I'll do. I'll tear down my barns and build bigger ones, and there I will store all my grain and my goods. I'll say to myself, you have plenty of good things laid up for many years. Take life easy. Eat, drink, and be merry. And doesn't that sound like Solomon here? Like it just seemed like this is the path that he was on. And if it was just that easy to eat, drink, and be merry. Solomon says, I ate more than anybody. I drank more than anybody. I had more pleasurable experiences. And I'm telling you right now, that road is a dead end. The rich man says to himself, you have plenty of good things laid up for you for many years. Take life easy, right? So from his perspective, life is good. Then notice what Jesus says. You fool. This very night, your life will be demanded from you. Oh, man, our mortality comes back into the picture. Why? Because our mortality underscores how little control we really have. And then he says this, then who will get what you have prepared for yourself? Somebody else is going to get your stuff. This is how it will be with anyone who stores up things for himself, but is not rich towards God. So that we wouldn't miss the point, I put this in this little box over here. From man's perspective, this guy was rich. He had an abundance of crops. He had a vast treasure on earth. He made two miscalculations, though. He thought all that stuff was going to be for him. And he thought all that stuff meant that he had a long life. And he was wrong on both accounts. Because all that stuff, what does God say? He says, you should have been rich towards God. You just showed yourself to be so foolish. Because someone else is going to get that stuff, and your life, which rests in God's hands and of which you have no control, is acquired of you today. You see, Jesus made it clear what Solomon has been teaching, that our life doesn't consist in the abundance of our possessions. Jesus intimates here, and Solomon will tell us, that the secret is going to be in our relationship with a God in whom we live and move and have our very being. That's where you're going to find your ultimate meaning and purpose, because nothing can ever take that away from you. So how do you become successful? Make some good decisions. How do you make good decisions? Learn from the bad ones. And then fix your eyes on the one who says, I will help and I will heal. I will love and I will lift. Amen. Let's pray. Father in heaven, I want to thank you so much for these words. I pray these truths that swim around in our brains right now will just sink down deeply into our hearts. I pray, Lord, that you would enable us to have conversations around a dinner table. I pray that we take what we learned and find opportunity to share that with friends and family, so that at the end of their days, they don't come to a place where they hate life. They hate their things. They despair of life. No, no, no. Lord, you tell us that if we know you, our life could be filled with love and joy and peace and patience, with a gentleness, a goodness, a faithfulness, a kindness, a self-control that could only be accounted for because your Spirit lives in us. That is the one possession that we'll take to heaven with us. And so, Father, we pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen.